Hi, my name's Anthony Ward and welcome to this tutorial for 3D World magazine. What we're going to look at over the next series of videos is more of an introduction to nCloth and nHair. Now, when talking about dynamic systems in Maya or any other application for that matter, it can be quite scary. To somebody who's never used them before, the thought of suddenly playing around with these systems can be quite intimidating. Now what I hope to do with this tutorial is show you that it's quite easy to set up a cloth simulation and also hair. It's quite simple to control these and get pretty good results quite quickly. So at the end of this tutorial, I'm hoping that you'll learn how to use nCloth, how to use nHair. You've got a good understanding of the basics, so you can then go on and apply them to anything you want in the future, and also take what you've learned and expand upon it and start exploring some of the more advanced elements associated with these systems. So where do we begin? Well, we have a scene already set up for us here. You can see we have our superheroine character, who I think we're going to be calling Dyna Girl. The scene's set up, she's modelled, there's lighting in there, so let's say she's pretty much ready to render. But as you can see, the cape model is very stiff. We want to add something to that to make it a lot more dynamic. She's also bald, so we need to also create some hair for her. Now, we have the cape mesh already built, so we're already off to a good start with creating our nCloth. I've already gone in and added in a few creases and folds here and there. I've also attached it to this clasp here. Well, not physically attached it, but made sure that the mesh goes behind it, just so it looks correct. I've also followed the mesh over the shoulders. Again, just to give us a bit of a head start. We know this is going to be a static image. She's not going to be moving around and animating in the scene, so we can cheat a little bit and sort of skip over some steps. And like I said, just give us a head start. Save us a little bit of work. Now for the hair, we could select the body and assign the hair to the body. But then what's going to happen is she's going to have hair growing out of everywhere. What we need to do is dictate exactly where we want the hair to grow from. Now, just like we have with the cape, we need a model which is going to dictate this area. If I just switch to X-ray, we look inside, just inside the head here, we have another model hidden away, and that's just a scalp mesh. If I move that up, turn off X-ray, as we can see, again, it's quite a simple mesh. All it is a duplicate of the body with just everything that we don't need deleted. So all we've done is marked out where we want the hair to grow from. What I've done then is just dropped it back inside, just so it rests just inside the head itself. This way it's hidden, it won't get rendered, and the hair will actually look like it's growing out of this out of her head. So we have our two meshes set up and we're pretty much ready to go. So let's start working now, and we will look first at adding the cloth. We're going to look at the cloth first because it's much easier to set up and it will ease us gently into the tutorial. Plus it will also give us a little bit of a head start with the hair as well, but you'll see that as we progress. So how do we create cloth basically? Well, we have our mesh. All we need to do is say to Maya, right, we want this to be a cloth simulation. So make sure you are in your nDynamics menu here, which will bring up these particles, nMesh, nHair, nConstraint. All we're going to do is go to nMesh, create nCloth. Now if you open up the options, there's not many to play around with in here, and what you would do is if there was some other dynamic system in this scene, you would be able to say to Maya, use the existing solver just so that it all works together. But there's nothing currently in the scene, So we're just going to go straight away and click Create Cloth. Now, as you can see, all it's done is it's just dropped off. It's turned smooth mesh off, and what we'll do is we'll leave it off for now, as that will speed up the calculation slightly. What we've also done is we can see now that it's attached an nCloth shape here. If I open up the attributes, we have our cape here, output cloth, we have our nCloth shape. Now that's the area that we're going to be most interested in. This has all the attributes in it so that we can tweak to sort of define the properties of our cloth, how it moves, how it bends, and how it interacts with the scene. We also have a nucleus node here, and this is where all the main calculations are going to be performed, and we can also add in some other sort of forces and influences. So what I'm going to do first, let's just test that this cloth is working correctly. All I'm going to do is let's just make that a little bit bigger. Let's click play. And we can see that the cloth is moving, and all that's happening at the moment is gravity, because that's the only force that we've dictated, is pushing down on the cloth. So let's go back to the beginning, click play, and we can see that's moving. Now, two things spring to mind. First of all, it's stopping way too soon, but all we need to do is just up the amount of time we've got to play with in here. So let's just give that a ridiculously large amount, like 10,000. Zoom out a little bit so we can see where it's going to fall. Click play. And there we go. We'll let it play. And the simulation takes over and the cloth is falling down towards the floor. Again, all that's influencing it at the moment is gravity. Let's stop that and rewind. Now it's moving a little bit slow. So let's select the cloth. Open up the attributes. And let's just turn off the collisions for now. Close that down, and that should speed up the simulation. As you can see, that's much faster. And there's the cloth disappearing down there, and there it goes. So there we've just quickly made the cape into an nCloth shape. Nothing complicated, it's not taken us too long. And we've basically defined that as cloth. Now the problem is, as you saw, it's falling through her body and it's also dropping down through the floor. So we need to pin some areas. Now according to this scene, we have a clasp here, and that must be where the cape is actually pinned to. So we could pin the cape here, let the dynamics take over, but then it'll still fall through her shoulders. So we've got two choices there. We can either define these meshes here as collision objects, and so long as they're connected to the nucleus as well and the same system, Maya will automatically know that this cloth needs to collide with these meshes here. Now, we're not going to use collisions. Firstly, collisions are quite expensive, so that it will take a long, when we're playing our simulation, it will slow it down quite a bit because it's going to be calculating which points are colliding with where. And for this particular scene, it's a static scene. We don't need her to animate, so we can cheat a little bit and maybe, rather than just pin the front here, why don't we pin the whole mesh over her shoulders? We've already sort of sculpted it to fit loosely over her shoulders. We know that the wind is going to be blowing from the front and blowing the cape behind her, so we don't need to worry about the cape dropping down and colliding with her back. So let's just go in and pin some points and you'll just see sort of what I'm on about. Now, to pin vertices or anything to do with the cloth, we go across to our N constraint menu here, and as you can see, there's lots of different options to play around with. We're not going to get too bogged down with all those just yet. As I said, this is just an introduction to setting up nCloth. Like I say, once you've got the basics, you can go in and play around with a lot of these. all we're going to do is look at the transform constraint. So let's define what we want to pin. So let's say we want these vertices here, something like that. So it's just, so these aren't going to move. We're just going to go to n constraint transform, and that will have created, as you can see, a dynamic constraint shape. And those vertices are now blue to show that they are locked and pinned. Let's just turn on smooth mesh and just see how the simulation goes now. So if we click play, as you can see, the cape falls. These are locked in place, so they aren't going to be moving anywhere. And as I said, the cape falls through her body, but then we haven't defined her as a collision object, but we don't need to because we want the cape to blow gently behind her, or maybe fiercely behind her. Let's stop that and rewind. Now, we've been pressing play all the time to sort of activate our simulation. Let's drop that back down to a normal mesh. You can instead, if we open up our nSolver menu here, and you'll also find this on your shelf as a couple of green arrows, we have interactive playback, and we're going to be using that from now on. If I click interactive playback, actually let's just stop that. What I want to do is select our dynamic constraint. Now if I click interactive playback, I can actually edit the cape and move this around, and as you can see, it's updating in real time according to what I'm doing. If I just undo that, let's stop this, rewind. If I clicked play instead, as you can see, I can't actually, you can move it, but it's not very interactive. It sort of jumps. Let's undo those. Jump back to the beginning. So what we can also do with interactive playback is if we select our cloth, let's just move this over. As well as moving the transform constraint around, we can play around with all the values in here. And that's what we're going to do next. At the moment, the cape just drops. So we're just going to go to our nucleus. If we drop some of these, we're not interested in any of these. We're just going to look at this gravity and wind tab. So if I click select, just so it deselects this and just selects the nucleus. Click interactive playback. Now our cape drops, but now we can start playing around with these elements here. So wind speed, we want to add a bit of wind into the scene. So let's turn that up. As you can see, that's now blowing, and this is the wind direction. So this is going across 1 in X. So maybe we want it to go the opposite way. So because we've got interactive playback on, I can set that to -1 and it updates automatically. We maybe want it to go back slightly as well. So we've got X, Y and Z. So maybe we want it to blow upwards a touch. So let's maybe set that to 2. As you can see, that updates for us. And Z, again, let's set that to -1. And there we can see the cape has started to lap behind her. And what we can do is we can always just rewind and restart the playback. Now we've got those settings. And there we have the cape just blowing gently behind her. We can add a bit of noise into that. Maybe set that to 5 instead. As you can see, that's starting to billow nicely. We can increase the wind speed to make that faster. We can also increase the air density, which is just going to make that a lot more ferocious, as you can see. So there we're starting to make the cape look a lot more interesting. Now, we still have a few problems. The cape's bending in on itself, but we haven't actually gone in and changed any of the settings for the properties of the cape itself. All we've done is edited the nucleus, which is effectively affecting the scene rather than just the cape. So now we've got the nucleus set, we've adjusted our wind direction, we've made the cape a lot more interesting. Let's select the cape itself, go to the nCloth shape, let's scroll down, and we can look in the Dynamic Properties tab. Let's just stop and restart the playback. Now the cape looks like it's stretching a bit too much, so we have this stretch resistance here. We could turn that up just so that it won't stretch much. We could edit the bend resistance so it doesn't bend as much, and as you see, as I turn that up, because we're using interactive playback, we can adjust these and see them in real time. So we'll drop that down. And again, that bend resistance is just stopping it bending. So we maybe, if we set that to 1, see what it has. That's still quite rigid. 0.5. We've got a little bit of motion in there. You know, and at this stage it's just tweaking these to get the cape to look like you want it to look. Sometimes you just need to rewind and play it again. That's better. Now we've just got a little movement. Drop this down. And again, it's just tweaking these values. Set that to 1. And then we've got a lot more movement on there. Maybe 1.5. So something like that. And we're starting to get a nice flow of the cape. Okay, obviously, compression resistance is going to stop it sort of collapsing in on itself. So we can turn this up. And again, if you turn it up too much, it's just going to make the cape quite rigid. So again, let's just restart it just to test. So you can see there, we're playing around with these values here. We're not concerned with anything else. We're just tweaking these. We're not getting bogged down in other sort of dynamic system attributes or anything just yet. We've got our nucleus, which has given us our wind and our main forces. We could turn down the air density a little bit. Maybe just set that back to 1. And then we've got our cloth shape, and all we're editing is the dynamic properties. If we scroll down here, we can see there's a lot more we can play around with in here. We could edit the mass, so how heavy the cape is. If we drop that down, you can see it just completely goes wild because we've made the cape a lot lighter. So obviously the wind's going to affect it a lot more. So maybe drop that to 5. We have other options here with the lift, the drag, how rigid it is. If we turn that up, obviously it's just going to be back to our rigid board. So we don't want it rigid, we want it quite loose. So for now, I'm just going to leave you to tweak these values. Like I've shown you, it's quite simple. Just play around with these until you get a cape that you're happy with. Rewind. Interactive playback again. And that is the basics of setting up nCloth. Now obviously there's a lot more we can look at in here. You know, we've got all these other options down here. But like I said, this is just an introduction. We're just easing you into the systems gently. What you've done up to now is you've just defined cloth, applied some wind and turbulence to it, and started to adjust how the cloth is actually going to flow and move around in space. So that's the cloth set up. What we'll do now is we'll break here, and in the next video we'll start to investigate adding and adjusting her hair. So after a bit of tweaking, we've got something which resembles a bit more of a nice flowing cape. And rather than having to go in and build these different folds and creases, we've got something looking a lot more natural. And when we get to a stage or a particular pose that we're happy with, we can just stop the simulation, render out our scene, and we've got the cape done. We could also add a bit of motion blur to it now that it's animating, and it opens up a lot more options. If we wanted to move the character around, then the dynamics would update accordingly. Or if we wanted to change the wind direction, we just change it in the nucleus. So we've pretty much nailed the basics of creating the nCloth. There's just one more thing that I wanted to touch upon, which I missed on the previous video. If you open up your options in your attribute editor, we have our properties that we were playing around with previously, but if you want a head start, again, if you want a particular look or feel to the cloth, there are a number of presets already set up. So in here we have lots of weird and wonderful things like honey, a rubber sheet, silk. So you could always use one of those to start you off, and then you can go in and sort of refine the look and feel. So that's just a little tip, just again to give you a little bit of a head start. So now we have our cloth. Let's just go back and play it again. Again, you can just go in and tweak this as much as you want. Once you've got the hair in the scene, you can play around with those basic dynamic values if you're not happy with how it's looking at the moment. So now we've got the cloth, let's turn our attention to adding hair. Let's stop this simulation for now. We'll close down this window. So we have our scalp model, which is buried inside the head here. Let's go back to our perspective view. Now to create the hair, all we're going to do is go to select our scalp model, go to nHair, create hair, but this time we're going to open the options. Now these options are probably slightly different to the default options. So if I reset the settings, you'll see. Now by default we have a U and V count of 8 and 8, and this is how the hair is spread out over that scalp object. Now I want a little bit more hair to play with, so I'm going to set this to 20 and 20. Now this will create follicles, and from those follicles will be guide curves which will guide how the actual clumps of hair move and react, and well, basically how dynamic they are. The problem is with the spacing, there's going to be patches of the head which are bald. Now we could turn up the U and V count a little bit more, but all this is going to do is give us a lot more things to play with and have to edit. Instead, we can use the passive fill option here, and all we're going to do is set that to 1. What that will do is that will add in other random follicles on the head, but they won't be editable. All they will do is basically mimic what's happening with the follicles around them. So they're basically just there. Well, as the name suggests, it's just a way of passively filling the head without giving you more work to do. Now clumps, points per hair, we'll leave that at 10, and the length we'll leave that at 5 for now and just see how it comes out. Now the hairs per clump we'll also just leave that as 10. So let's click create. And there we have our initially spiky hairstyle, and you can see here we've got the red follicles. Now they're our main follicles. They're the ones that we can go in and control if we want later. We also have blue follicles, and they're the passive ones, so they're the ones that we don't edit. And you can see it's added in quite a few, and we've got quite a nice spread over the head. And just a little tip, if you're having issues with how the hair is spreading over the top of the scalp object, make sure it's got a nice set of UVs on it, because it uses the UVs to sort of dictate where the placement is going to be. So the first thing that stands out is the hair is quite short. So what I'm going to do is make sure I'm back at frame 1 or frame 0, wherever you created the hair, so it's all spiky. Going to nHair, scale hair tool. So let's just select the hair, nHair, scale hair tool. We'll just click on the hair, and we can initially make that longer or shorter. Now we want it quite long. Let's make it ridiculously long like that. So we've got the hair created, so let's just see how it reacts to our current scene. We'll just click play for now. Now we've got our cape flowing, and the hair is actually following what the cape is doing, and that's because by default Maya has realised that there's already a nucleus in the scene, so it's just saying use the same nucleus. You can change it to use a different one if you've got more than one in the scene, but for now this is ideal because we want the hair to do exactly what the cape is doing. So that just saves us a bit of a job there. So let's rewind that. Let's select the hair, open up the options. Let's turn on our interactive playback, but what I'm going to do first is select hair system shape here. You can see we have the nucleus attached. We're going to select our hair system shape, click select. We'll go to solvers, we'll open up this window, this menu again. Interactive playback, and there the hair is moving. Now again, if we wanted the hair to fall down over her shoulders, we would probably use collision objects to do that, just so the hair would fall naturally and it wouldn't fall into the mesh. But because, like the cape, the hair is blowing behind the head, this is a static image, so we don't have to worry about how the back of the head looks. We're just going to not bother using collisions. Again, it will just ramp up the simulation time, and it'll give you a lot more things to play around with. We're just going to keep things simple and just focus on the main areas. So the hair's moving, but it's not moving as wildly as the cape, but it's using the same settings. So if we edit the nucleus, it's going to also edit the cape. Luckily, the hair has some other extra options built in. If we've got our hair system shape selected, if we go down to turbulence, you can see we have some more options in here. So let's just turn up that intensity. And you can see the hair is now waving all over the place. It's looking a lot more wild and a lot more interesting. Now obviously we can also go in, adjust the frequency, adjust the speed, and just tweak those just to get it flowing in a much nicer way and a much more interesting way, rather than it just being flat. So that's looking a bit more interesting, a little bit better. What we can also do is open up our dynamic properties and start to play around, just like we did with the cape, start to play around with how the hair is actually, the properties of the hair. And we've got things in here like bend resistance. If I turn that up, you see, it stiffens it up so it's not as bendy. We drop this down. So this just sort of brings it away from the head. If we drop it to 0, you see there's just no resistance there. So let's try setting that to 1, and that just brings it closer to the head. So maybe we want to set that at 2. Just to pull it away from the head a little bit. And obviously this depends on how you want the hair to look. Maybe you do want the hair to be quite off the actual scalp, something like this. We have other options in here, the stiffness. Again, that just makes the hair stiffer from the root going out. Stretch resistance, just like with the cape, it stops the hair stretching when there's too much of an influence on there. Twist resistance as well. Extra bend links, that just smooths out the actual how the hair bends. Now as you see, we've adjusted these and the hair's gone a little bit wild, so what we can do is just rewind, activate interactive playback again, and then we can go in and adjust those again. So extra bend links, we can add a couple of those in. It's just going to soften how this bends around here. So those, we can just play around with those again, just to get something that we're happy with. So I can leave you to just tweak those to your heart's content. We're just concentrating on the dynamic properties and the turbulence for now. Again, we can turn that down, flatten the hair off, ramp it right back up. So we've got our hair moving, and if we zoom in, we've got each of these clumps, but they're all quite small, and they all look quite linear and quite uniform. And if we rendered this, we'd have these weird little clumps coming out of her head. So now we can go in, once we're sort of happy with how the hair's moving, we can now go in and edit how the hair is looking. And we can just move up to this clump and hair shape tab here. Now hairs per clump, we're not going to edit that just yet. All that does, if I zoom in here, you see each of these lines, that is basically a hair. So we've got 10 hairs per clump, so there's just 10 of these on these. Now we're not going to ramp that up just yet. We're going to leave that as it is. Again, turning up settings like that will influence the actual playback of the simulation. Subsegments, that is just going to soften. See how that just bend, the bend there was quite rigid. We've just softened that up. Again, that's something we can edit later when we come to rendering. We're not going to edit any of those first set just yet, apart from clump width. If I turn that up, you see the base of the clump is getting wider and getting thinner. And that is filling out the base of the hair. So let's make that a little bit wider. Let's maybe make that 1.5. So that's looking a bit better, and the hair is now filling out the top of the head. The hair width we're going to leave because that, again, that is more a rendering thing. But what we can do is we can go in and we can edit the way the clumps work and just refine them a little bit more. And we can go down here. Now we edited the clump width, and now we have a clump width scale just below it. And you'll notice there's lots of these little graphs for a lot of the options. Basically, all this will do is it will say the scale at the beginning here. If you see, as I adjust this, it's getting shorter and getting wider. That is basically this value here. So that is 1.5. And as it's getting towards the end of the hair, it's getting smaller, so it's thinning out the clump. If I make that bigger, you'll see the ends of the clumps get wider. If I make that shorter, they come to a nice little point. Now you've got those 2 points there. You can also click and add in other points. So we could maybe start the hair off thin, make the clump wide, and then it goes thin again. Or we can add in lots more of these and vary how each clump is looking. So you can end up with some weird and wonderful effects. What we're going to do is we're just going to concentrate. We'll maybe start it off wide, keep it wide for quite a while, and then maybe it tapers off towards the end. And if you want a bit more control over this, you can make each point, you can change how smooth these move into each other. You can also click on this button here, which will open up a bigger version of the graph, which you can then go in and just refine this a little bit more. So we could select this, and we could maybe set that to linear, set it to none, smooth, although that doesn't appear to be changing much. We'll leave it as smooth for now, but that should update and make that a lot sharper or a lot smoother. So you can play around with your clump width. We could make that wider or thinner, and it's just going to update according to this graph. So what else can we play around with? Hair width scale, again, we're not going to worry about that because that is to do more with rendering. You won't see anything updating here, and we'll look at rendering in the next video. Let's just work our way down. Clump curl. This is exactly what you would expect it to do. This will add curls to the clumps. So if I increase that, you can see we've got curls here. So if you want your hair curly, you'd adjust this. Perhaps you want it to be not curly at the base, so 0.5. because 0 will sort of reverse the curl, 1 will do a positive curl. So maybe it doesn't start curly, but towards the tips it gets curly, like so. Clump flatness. Now what this will do is it will just, at the moment the clumps are circular from the base out, all this will do is just flatten each of those clumps. So if we ramp that up, each of those is now flat rather than round. As you can see on the head there, if I zoom in a little bit, it's flat. So there are options there for if you want the fringe to maybe come down over her head and you want that part to be flat, you can adjust that. Now at the moment, all these are affecting every clump. Now, not wanting to get too advanced, you can go in and refine each clump on its own so that it has its own properties away from what the global properties are. But again, that's more of an advanced thing to look at, and we'll probably look at that in another tutorial if we do a more advanced look at hair and cloth. So clump flatness. Let's just skip down. Obviously we have our collisions here. We could turn that off, and again that speeds up because we know we're not using collisions. But if you wanted to, you could have the hair colliding with itself for a bit more of a realistic look and feel. At the moment it's not going to be doing much, but we're not interested in the collisions at the moment, so we're going to just skip over that. So that's pretty much the basics again of just setting up that hair. We've added it into the scene, we've adjusted the properties, we've adjusted we've looked at editing the clumps, and all sorts of little tweaks here and there. And again, just like the cape, you should maybe go in now and just start playing around with these. Oh, we've come to the end of our animation there. Let's go back to the beginning. Interactive playback. So yeah, just play around with these values, continue to tweak them until you're getting the hair more, concentrate more on how the hair is moving and looking in the viewport. And then when you're happy, we'll jump into the next video, and then we'll start to look at how to get the hair rendered. So up to now, we've applied dynamics to the cape to give it much more of a natural shape and flow. Plus we've got the flexibility of the animation in there if we want to use motion blur, or do we want to experiment with a few different poses, or from the wind coming from different directions. We've also added in hair to the scene, and we've also done the same with that, adjusted its properties and the look and the feel of it, just so it flows in a nice way, and we've got sort of a nice result from that. So I guess we're probably at the end of the tutorial, aren't we now? Because looking at the scene, we should be able to just render her out and it's done. So let's just look at a render and see where we're at. This is one I've just rendered out. Now straight away, we've got some major issues with the hair. In the Maya scene, it looks fine, and she's got a nice full head of hair, but in the actual render, it's quite thin and wispy. It's almost not there at all. So let's address that now. We just need to change a few render settings just to thicken the hair up. So let's select the hair, and let's just work our way down and just gradually adjust things as they crop up. So first of all, hairs per clump. Now if we bring back the render, I'll just move this over. Now obviously if we've only got 10 hairs for each clump that's on her head, it's not going to be very thick, and that's probably why it's looking so frail and wispy. So let's just ramp that up to 50. Let's just minimize this because it'll update in the scene as well. So we turn that up to 50, and you can see in here, if I just click select, that has thickened up the hair in here as well. Now obviously this is going to have an impact on the simulation itself, but luckily we have a display quality tab here, and we can drop that back down just so if we click play, it's not going to slow the scene down too much. So we can adjust this however we want to sort of counterbalance what we're adding in here. So moving a bit further down, let's skip ahead to hair width, and this is again, the hair's quite frail, so we maybe want to thicken up each hair. We'll just maybe double that, just so each hair is twice as thick. And then moving down, if we wanted to, we could adjust the graph here, so the hair's maybe thicker at the root and thinner at the end, so we could make that taper right off to nothing. Maybe pull that back, so it starts off thick and then just quickly sort of thins out towards the end. Or we'll maybe have that towards the middle, so it's not as severe. We'll just keep moving down. And obviously we have our shading tab, and in here this is going to control the colour, the specularity, the translucence, you know, all these obvious things here. If we open up this tab as well, we can see we have a hair colour scale here. Now these aren't the default values for some reason. I'll just add in, I think the default values are something like, that starts off darker at the root and then it gradually gets lighter. Something like that. So you're probably looking at something a bit more like that. Just drop that one down a bit as well. But we'll come to that later anyway. Let's just skip these. We're not going to look at the colour just yet. We're just looking at thickening up the hair. So let's just see where we were. We've added more hair. We've thickened up the hair. Let's see what else there is. If we come down here, there's this tab here called multi-streaks. Now what this will do is just multiply the streaks of hair. So if we add 2 multi-streaks in there, let's just see how the hair is looking now that we've added those few simple bits in. So we'll save this render, and what I'll do is, you can see the render time is 1.5 minutes, so I'll pause the video while I do the next render. So that's the new render, and as you can see, obviously the hair has thickened up quite a lot just by editing those values, and the render time's also increased slightly too. If I just compare before, after, so there we've fixed those initial errors, and just going back over it, what I should have done is also increase the subsegments a couple, just to obviously smooth out the hair a little bit more, as it's looking a little bit rigid at the front here. So you can continue to tweak those just to balance out the thickness, also editing the graphs to get the exact look that you're after. Now the next thing that we obviously need to fix is the colour of the hair and the actual look and feel of the material of the hair. If I drop this back down, and this is where we scroll all the way back down to our, actually let's go to multi-streaks. I'm going to drop that down to 1 because as you can see here it's looking quite linear, and that can often be an effect of the multi-streaks. But I'm getting sidetracked anyway. So let's now jump into our shading menu. Now these are just the default settings, but as you saw, I was tinkering with this graph earlier, trying to get it back to the default values because for some reason the default values have got lost somewhere. But this controls the amount of hair colour that goes down the length of each hair. So here it's almost like a colour opacity gradient. White means there's more colour and darker means there's less colour. So if we wanted to have the hair the same colour from the root right the way to the tip, we would make this white, or we'd brighten it up like so. Now obviously we don't want the hair colour to be brown, so let's make this a wild sort of red colour, maybe darken it down a little bit, and it's updating in the viewport as well, just so we can get a rough idea. Now let's move down here. Opacity, this is obviously going to change how see-through each hair is. So at the moment they're all quite solid, so let's drop this down to maybe something like, let's just drop it down to half just to see the difference. Translucence is how much light is going to pass through each hair, so let's leave that at 0.5. The specular colour, let's make this red as well, sort of a bright red colour. And the specular power, basically the higher the number, the sharper the specular. So let's just turn this up to 10, just to make those highlights a bit sharper. So we've edited these, Now obviously the opacity, if your hair is more see-through and you've got backlight like we have on this character, the light's going to come through around the edges a lot more, and that's just going to look a lot better. So the more opaque the hair is, the better. But obviously if it's too opaque, then you're just going to see through it too much. So you have to balance that out as well. So now we've changed those colours, I'll just do another render and then we'll compare. So that's that render done. Now the render time has increased again a little bit, but the hair's looking a lot more interesting than it was before. You can see, yes, the red's probably a bit too bright, so we'll maybe darken that red down a little bit. The specular's looking okay. We could maybe adjust that a little bit more. Maybe do, I mean, we're rendering at 512 by 512 now, just so it'll fit on the screen, but I would suggest doing a much larger render when you're working with hair, just so you can see exactly where the actual strands of hair are going and how they're looking. So this is where we started off with our quite frail wispy hair. Then we thickened it out slightly, and this is it. We're just refining the colour, and we've got the nice backlight coming through and catching the hairs around the edges. So let's just go a step further and just start to refine the hair a little bit more. I'll just save that render just so we can keep comparing. So actually, let's just go back. Now, one thing we can change initially is, at the moment the hair is quite uniform, so it's the same along each clump. It's going to be, each strand of hair is going to be exactly the same. So we can add a bit more variety to this. If we go back up to our main clump and hair shape, we have a thinning tab here. Now we'll see if we can see it in the viewport. If I increase this, as you can see, the hair sort of creeps back. And what this is doing is sort of varying each hair in the clump. So we're getting more random sort of ends to the hair. And again, this is making it look a lot more interesting. At the moment, previously, as you can see, let's just go back, let's go to our perspective view so we can get a bit closer. As we can see, each clump, sort of each hair in that clump, they all end at the same time, right at the end of each curve. As we add an element of thinning, you can see some of those hairs pulling back. So we're getting that variety in there. Now I'm just going to turn this right up to 1, and you can just see it's just fading away the hair at the end. So that, again, that's just adding a bit more variety in there, making it maybe look a little bit more realistic. Now obviously you maybe don't want it to set to 1, so it's another attribute for you to just start playing around with. What we can also do, if we scroll down, we have our displacements tab here. And this is going to add a bit of noise and a bit of sort of randomness to the hair as well. Now we can add a bit of a curl to it. So this is just going to add a bit more of a random curl. I can adjust the frequency. We've got noise method. You've got your different options, surface UV or clump UV, and then you can go in and like this. As you can see, that's sliding around the actual head itself. So what we'll do is we'll set it to random, and this is just going to give us, as you can see, it's very subtle, but it's just going to give us a little bit of random noise in there. We can adjust the frequency, and then we've got sub-clumping method, and this is just going to add like sort of little clumps. See how it's pulling the hair together, and again you can add a random amount to that and adjust the number of sub-clumps. So again, this is just adding a bit more variety to your hair. So once you've done the main shape, you've got your colours, your opacity, you've added curls or whatever to it, you can go in and just add a bit more randomness. Now and again, we've got another graph here which controls where we want our displacements to be. So let's say we want the hair to be okay at the beginning but then get all the randomness towards the end. We'll maybe just add in another point here, and you can see it updating in the viewport. So we want slight randomness coming up to the middle, and then it gets quite random towards the end. So it's just another couple of values for you to play around with. So let's maybe leave that there, because what we're in danger of doing now is starting to venture more into advanced territory. And the whole point of this tutorial was just to introduce you to these basic steps, show you that it's not difficult to get hair and cloth set up. You can play around with it, and it's just these key values which give you this sort of the look and the feel of the hair and the cloth. If we start to move a bit further forward now, then we're going to step into the realms of more advanced areas. And I think what I'd like to do is leave this here, and we'll maybe explore that in a future tutorial. But for now, you've got the basics. So let's do a final render and just see what difference editing those values has done. So I'll pause the video again. So there's the current render. If we compare it with what we had before it's a lot thicker, but now because we've added that element of thinning towards the end as thinned out, for want of a better word. Now we've maybe added a bit too much, but all we need to do is just adjust that slider, do another render, and just start to tinker with it a little bit more. And that randomness is coming through with the sub-clumping and the noise. And we also made the hair colour a little bit darker, but I'm quite liking the way the backlight's coming through here and catching these hairs just around the rim. So there's not really much more that I want to look at in this tutorial. Like I say, now we've got the basics covered. The next step, we're going to start venturing into more advanced territory, and I'll leave that for another tutorial. What I'd like you to do now is just take what you've learned and just continue playing around with the hair, adjusting those main sliders and values that we've been looking at, and see if you can get a nicer hair look and feel, something that you're a lot happier with. And the same with the cape. Maybe you want a thicker cape, so you can adjust those values as well, playing with its mass, its rigidity, and all those sorts of things. Again, just to get the look that you're after. And I think we will leave the tutorial here. So I hope you've learnt a lot from this, and I hope it's opened your eyes to the use of dynamics and using actual hair rather than using polygon strips or geometry. It'd be nice if you take what you've learned and expand upon it. But yep, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next tutorial.